we could just toss two other challenges in. We identified two opposite challenges. Okay, one is faculty who say, hey, I've been teaching 30 years, I'm an expert. And I've certainly, so you can't tell me anything. You haven't been around as many years as I have. But I've also seen the opposite, okay? And I don't think we should underestimate this. I saw faculty colleagues at the University of Chicago not even willing to put up their own photographs when the graduate students decided the lunchroom where everybody went in astronomy was boring, and sent out an email and said, oh, if you're a photographer or something, bring in pictures. And I overheard one faculty member say to another, how naive of Louisa to think that we would compete in something at which we are not expert, quote unquote. Okay? And these are people with very high standards, and in their field they are the best in the world and they've worked at it, and that's satisfying to be. And now you come along and say, oh, and we'd also like to judge your teaching. And they are smarter, they're not ignorant about these different methodologies. They're actually knowledgeable enough to know that they are not the master, you are. And they're used to being the best person there is. And they don't want to lower their standards, and therefore they can't engage with your message.
Well, remember, they're also not being rewarded the same way for their teaching.
Again, I want to move back into the crafting of effective messages, because we could talk about that for a long time. So there's an interesting study that came out specifically about science communication that I thought was perhaps illustrative for us. I'm just going to read this little segment of a synopsis of it. Despite the rhetoric, not much has changed at the lab bench. While she found that researchers were aware of the push to have scientists talk about their research, and in fact many had taken the time and expended resources to do so, how they talk about their work with the public seems pretty impervious to change. Researchers she talked to still cling to the now discredited deficit model. The public is ignorant, and it's up to scientists to make them better able to appreciate and support their work. The assumption underpinning their approach to public communication is that transfer of information will unproblematically educate the audience, a model of communication that is simplistic at best. This sort of, deficit model, if you don't mind if I share what you said a couple of weeks ago, Steve, that Steve said, I realized that sometimes I still just realize, still just feel like if I just had 30 minutes of their time, that I could, share some results, share some information, and they would see what it is that we're talking about. So I feel like we still do kind of implicitly operate under a deficit model, even though we know that we need to have a two-way conversation. This is why I think that this relates to what you were talking about, Mike, because the real concerns that people have are part of that two-way dialogue, as opposed to us, trying to just do a one-way conversation. These concerns that people have are real, and we need to have this dialogue, but we also need to be able to effectively get our message across. So the deficit model is bad, and it's good to try to recognize, I think someone brought up something like this idea of productive resources. Like, what is it that people are bringing to the table that we can work with and build on to try to get across the ideas and message that we want to get across. And one thing, I think it might have even been you, Andrea, when we were talking about this with the STFs, she said that works well to open up that conversation is to ask teachers, what do you like and not like about your classroom right now? Sort of, opening up this more dialogue-oriented conversation. But that, of course, would be for one specific audience. And doing brown bag lunches where you're, soliciting people's opinions on learning goals, stuff like that. That's one way to do these sorts of dialogues with faculty. But I want to talk about communicating beyond just faculty, but those are a couple of things that came up in conversation. So I want to get a little bit more concrete and share a couple of examples. I have audio, and the reason that I use audio when I'm talking about science communication is because you can hear people saying it in their own words, and it's much more like sitting down with that person and talking. So I have to switch over to iTunes, and these might be a little loud. Come back. Sorry. Presentation mode.
Have enough windows open there.
My cursor is.
Left and
Okay.
right.
Oh, is it there? Well, I just unplugged so that I can actually navigate. Sorry. So, because we learn through contrasts, I am going to start out with an example that sounds more like your everyday scientist telling their everyday story about their research. And by playing this clip of this very famous person, I'm not trying to make fun of them as a communicator, but just indicate how it is we tend to talk off the cuff.
Could you just describe, and speak up if you can, describe as simply as you can your contribution, what you're getting the Nobel Prize for?
The citation is for the theoretical work I did in connection with the new phases of liquid helium-3, which were discovered experimentally in the early 70s. The experimental work has, in fact, received a Nobel Prize to Osherov, Richardson, and Lee. That I think was in 1996. What I did was basically to take the existing theory of superconductivity as developed by John Bardeen and his co-workers here at UIUC and apply it in a somewhat more sophisticated form.
So I don't think I need to keep playing it. You get the idea. And he's answering the question. He's answering the question of what he got the Nobel Prize for. But I bet the reporter's not going to use any of that tape. So I'm going to play a clip from Christopher Joyce, who has been at NPR for many, many years and is one of the great science communicators. He has a way of weaving together information. And what I want you to listen to in this clip, which unfortunately is a little bit muddy because it's a very old clip, I want you to listen to how the journalist, Chris Joyce, and how the scientists that he's interviewing, what are they doing effectively to tell the story of that research? I have to cue it up.
Sort of a medium with the plants around the tropical forest looking for unusual forms of life. There's a simple rule of thumb to remember. One thing leads to the next. For William Eberhard, who works at the University of Costa Rica and for the Smithsonian Institution, the trail began with a spider.
It's sort of a medium-sized spider. It's really beautiful. It's silver abdomen with black streaks and patches of gold and green and red.
What really intrigued Eberhard wasn't the spiders, though. It was their webs. These were orb spinners. Normally they make oval latticework webs, but many of these webs were weird-looking, just a big X with a sticky tangle at the center. And hanging from this tangle was a single cocoon, one Eberhard recognized as belonging to a small, stinging wasp.
I could see that these webs were very strange and that they somehow or other were associated with the presence of the wasp. That set me going.
Eberhard didn't have to go far. He found spiders in the act of weaving these strange webs. Each had the larva of the wasp stuck to its abdomen. They wove the basic superstructure of a web, but didn't finish. Eberhard watched these spiders for hours and slowly pieced together a bizarre Jacobean drama.
I think the spider never knew what hit. The spider sits at the hub of its orb, waiting for prey to land, and the wasp, when it's found the spider, it hovers above it for a few seconds, sort of lining itself up, and it darts down really suddenly and grabs the spider through the web with its legs and generally stings it right in the mouth.
That doesn't kill the spider. It's just paralyzed long enough for the wasp to lay its egg on the spider's abdomen. The spider soon wakes up, a bit groggy at first, and gets back to web weaving. Meanwhile, the egg hatches, and the wasp larva spends the next 10 days sucking the spider's blood.
Then, when it's grown big enough to finally finish the spider off, it induces the spider to build this very unusual web that the spider, during its lifetime, otherwise would never build.
So there's a lot of things that he does well there, of course.
But remember, biology is much more interesting.
I was going to say,
I mean, there's no
it's a little
way.
bit of a dirty trick to use bio and stuff.
It's not fair to
I will play you a clip about neutrinos.
Oh, come on.
And,
Bring it. Come on, bring it. We're ready.
that is actually the next clip. But what briefly, what are a couple of things that people noticed that he did well? That made that story work for
He
you?
didn't let the scientists say much.
Well, the scientists sounded interested. I mean, the
That's
scientists
true.
actually
That's
sounded
true.
like they cared.
Okay, so the scientist sounded interesting. He was a good talker.
Story.
And he did a story. That was exactly what it was that I wanted to bring up. Huh? Sorry?
Here, have an almond.
Well, he does a lot of stuff right. But in particular, he tells this story. So this is the abstract of that paper. These modifications differ qualitatively from those induced by congenital wasps. Parasitized spiders appear to adjust modified web construction behavior to local conditions. I mean, this is really boring, but he manages to make this sort of very difficult to understand, dense piece of information into this beautiful story where he's bringing up some drama and giving us a need to know. And I think that that's really key for a good storyteller. I mean, he builds up, and so you really want to find out what's happened to these spiders. And it's a really interesting story. So my question then is, how might that apply to communicating deeper?
So we have to wrap the students in cocoons and suspend them in the ceiling.
That's right, lay our eggs on.
Wrong application of analogy.
I've learned something today.
He's paying attention to surface features.
I think deeper's more susceptible from spiderweb. I think that the work that we're doing is more accessible, more relevant, more personal to the audience. I don't think I think we're still in that abstract stage about
Oh,
talking.
no, this is related to dating.
That could be.
Deeper is related to dating?
The point is, I think that the subject that we're dealing with here is something that is personally relevant to everybody. Everybody, that we are communicating with has been educated, has some form of investment in the nature of education, has some form of investment in the nature of our society. We don't necessarily draw on that, we don't pitch that. In some sense, there's, this question about sensationalism that's involved. But I think there's greater potential for what we do.
And
that said, it's also a liability. Because everybody also already cares about it, nothing stands out. I think that there's this
in
balance.
fact, what's the title of one of the most influential lectures in our field, the one that a lot of people know? Confessions of a Converted Lecturer by Eric Mazur. A lot of people heard that talk, and that's a story.
I'd like to second what Noah said, but point out that in my experience, the people who have articulated this the best are nobody in this room, but are some of the most self-aware undergraduate students. A couple of the LAs are just so compelling. And I had 3 students, not even 3 especially good students, sitting in my office this morning. And suddenly the conversation got off astronomy and it got to intercomparing the different ways teaching is done at CU. And they were unbelievably incisive and eloquent. On the one hand, they would say, what's a complete waste of time? And I'm a student, and this is my life, and this is meaningful to me. And to have a class where I actually learn something, and I can take that something and apply it, and it matters to me. They somehow did what Noah said, but in a little less academic way than we do, in a more compelling way, like maybe a good journalist would do.
I just want to check in. We do lose this room on the hour, right?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
I don't
That's
believe we
the
do
drama.
Today. Today we can go for like 4, 5, 6, 7.
Because I see that there are a lot of of
We have-
thoughts, and I do
we're-
want to get to a couple of the other clips.